And joining us now on 4029 News on the record is Chairman-elect of the Republican Party of Arkansas, Joseph Wood. Thank you so much, Chairman, for joining us today. First, congratulations on the new position. And tell us where you are after a night of debates.
Oh, wow. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. We're sitting in the great city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The Republican presidential debate primary debates was last night, and what a pretty electrifying night if you and your viewers got a chance to see that. But that's where we are here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
So what's the talk on the ground there in Milwaukee? What are people talking about the most of how the candidates did?
I think people were, I think it was a lot of expectations that were met. There was some that were surprising. If you start kind of running down, you got 8 candidates from, the various spectrums of folks. Two of the top, I think, discussion makers, if you will, would be probably Ambassador Nikki Haley as well as Vivek Ramaswamy. I think those are the two names, and two Indian descent, pretty amazing in the Republican Party that this is a reflection of who we are and what we're all about. But clearly, the discussion about Governor DeSantis and our own governor and Hutchinson, as well as Tim Scott. Each and every one had some play last night. So it was a lot of discussion, though, clearly.
Were there any issues that you were hoping would be asked last night or discussed, but was not?
Absolutely. I really wanted them to spend more time talking about more on the economy and inflation. I think most folks around the country want to address what some would say, how is Bidenomics really working? It kind of started that way, but really didn't spend enough time really detailing and going into it. What would be the work towards fixing what is ailing America, and that's this runaway inflation. And again, when folks are going to the gas station and trying to buy milk and eggs, they're just blown away with the prices that they're seeing. And we have a lot of those solutions by drilling and doing our own oil and energy here. And so I really wanted them to spend more time on inflation and economy, as well as, and they didn't spend a lot of time. Some of the candidates talked about it, which was the runaway border closing, the number of folks coming across the border, the amount of drugs coming through. We heard some discussion about the fentanyl, the trafficking, but again, really spending more time, because I think that is the biggest issues that are facing the country. And if you talk to Americans, that's how we spending more time overseas when we have not really secured our own borders, et cetera.
Chairman, some analysts say maybe it was a good thing for Trump that he didn't show up to the debate. What do you think about that? Do you think he missed out?
I do. I really wanted to see President Trump there. And even in his absence, he was there. I think each candidate had in some form or fashion something to say about that. And I think even the moderators brought up questions about that. And so there was this real, I think, miss of not having them there, President Trump there. But at the same time, he was there. He was part of the discussion, and maybe more than probably people wanted to have. But he was there in spirit, if you will.
Now, and I know a lot of Arkansans went, including you yourself, the executive director of the Republican Party of Arkansas, and also on stage, former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson. Up until this point, you know, everyone here in Arkansas knows who he is, but not necessarily at the national level. Do you think he made a name for himself? Do you think he could have done better to make it clear who he was?
I think any and everyone who made the threshold of having those 40,000 individual donors, as well as being at least at 1%, really did put themselves out there, and people now get a chance to really see and hear who these individuals are. And again, seeing Governor Hutchinson on that stage was pretty powerful from someone in Arkansas to be on that stage. I would say the same thing about Vivek Ramaswamy. Nobody knew who he was, or Governor Burgum out in North Dakota. Again, these are names that some folks in their states may know, and I think Governor Hutchinson has some familiarity being in the federal government, Congress, and Homeland Security, et cetera. But this now puts him on the front stage with a lot of others, like the DeSantis and the Vice President Pence, et cetera. So yes, I do think it did help by him being on stage. and now having everyone across the country spend a little time getting to know who he is and what he stands for.
Did you get a chance to talk to him in person?
I did not. None of the candidates that I get to. We were sitting on the floor, so we were in really good spot, good position, but could not get that close to any of the candidates.
All right, Chairman, what was the biggest surprise that you felt yesterday or that you saw?
The biggest surprise. Well, again, just looking at the candidates, you say, wow, you really have such a very diversity of thought. These guys really did differ on certain issues, diversity of where people have come from, the mix of having Nikki Haley there and then having some of the folks who've been around for a while, like Vice President Pence, and everything in between. The youthfulness of a young Vivek and to some of those who's been around. And so it was really interesting, panoramic to see that. But I really think the thinking, and I mentioned this before, the beauty of the Republican Party is we do have diverse thoughts, and that's what makes us so unique as a party. I also think, though, that that's what also causes some of the dynamics that we have sometimes, is because we do have different thoughts and opinions. But what brings us right back is what we stand for, which is, again, this Constitution, the life, liberty, and pursuit of, the big pieces of how do we allow more freedoms for the individual as opposed to the federal government, state government to manage and run it all.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Chairman-elect Wood of the Republican Party of Arkansas, giving us your take on what happened. And Democrats in Milwaukee were doing their own campaigning during the debate. They were highlighting Biden administration policies while laying out what they say the Republican Party stands for.
Let me sum this up for you all. No matter who you pick, this group is as extreme as it gets. A bag full of MAGA apples, and they are all rotten.
So far, Democratic candidates for president include President Joe Biden, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Marianne Williamson.